Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the top grades. In this series, as you know, we're only looking at 5 quotations per poem. I've slightly cheated here. Apologies in advance because this one is so packed full of imagery. I couldn't help myself. I've become an English teacher. However, we will be looking at the Fosse way as always. This method always gets you into grade 7 or above. We'll go through that in detail. We'll also ask the question whether Bayonet charge can be seen as a nature poem as well as the more obvious war poem. And then these are the 5 quotations coming up highlighted in yellow, so you know what you're going to be studying, what you're going to be learning, and hopefully this means your anthology full of annotations can be refined and made to make sense in much less time. So I will start, as always, with a quotation from the opening, because we always get the poet's point of view in the opening. Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw, in raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy. So we begin in media res, which is Latin for in the middle of the action. This is a dramatic opening, and it also gives us the author's point of view, that war is like an unnatural awakening. So normal life has suddenly become something completely different. Our normal lives, he is implying, are like a dream, and this soldier has awakened from that dream because he is suddenly in the middle of a war. And this experience is raw. So we've got this structural repetition here, and the repetition and enjambment of raw to raw gives us the idea of how painful war is emotionally as well as physically. And then this is also a homophone. Raw sounds like the sound raw, and he's giving us the idea of the noise of war as well, that has suddenly woke him up from this dream of normal life into terror. There are lots of ways he contrasts the experience of war with the dream of real life. And so one way is the speed. So he introduces the verb running here, and we've also got this idea of it happening suddenly. So we've got this idea of true speed. However, that is contrasted with the fact that this sentence doesn't end for ages. And you keep going, look, there's no full stop here. And it gives the poem a kind of breathlessness, which mimics the breathlessness of the soldier as he's running either towards certain death or to escape it. Another contrast is the things that are supposed to protect him are actually turning against him. So the khaki is the material of his uniform, but that itself has become hot as though it's attacking him. And even more, it's attacking him along all the seams. So the seams, where the stitching is everywhere, is making his skin raw. Now this rawness of the skin is both literal and metaphorical. So in a literal sense, this is where the fleas would be, the lice. So soldiers used to burn off the lice from their clothing and they'd find them in the seams. That was the place that you'd go to. But it's also the thickest part of the material that is rubbing against his skin and, if you like, rubbing it out. And I think we can actually say that because we're looking at this contrast, he's deliberately chosen raw because, read backwards, it's war, W-A-R. It's war that has caused this rawness, and for the things that are supposed to be protecting him to actually turn against him. Then we have this strange description of his sweat. Now, normally, if you think of a heavy sweat, it means that somebody is sweating a lot. But in this poem, the idea of heaviness also means weight. He's so desperate to escape that even the weight of his own sweat is slowing him down, just like the hot khaki is. And finally, for this image, it also conveys his fear. Now, although I talked about this image speeding up time because he's running, it's also slowing down time with the constant enjambment, the fact that the sentence doesn't end, and also in its sounds. So if we start looking at the introduction of the adverb, The repetition of the adjectives, raw seemed and hot, his sweat heavy, these are all ways to slow the action down, and it mimics the fact that this run, this charge, is taking too long. From the soldier's perspective, he's trapped in time, exposed, and about to be shot at any time. Okay, this links us to our next quotation. Bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. And now this is a bizarre line to have in the middle of the poem, and it's deliberately bizarre because the soldier's thoughts are bizarre. He's not thinking like we would in real life. So we've got the alliteration of bullets and belly, which is almost comical, and then the addition of comedy comes with the word smacking, as though you can just imagine someone smacking his belly, like some massive fat man taking his top off and using it as a drum. It's a comical image here. The bullets aren't actually that damaging to the air, they're just smacking its belly really hard. So this, of course, is personification, that the air has got this fat belly. And why has he introduced this air of comedy here? Well, perhaps it conveys the soldier's feeling of relief and amusement that he's actually not being killed by these bullets. Instead, they're just making this smacked belly sound as they go past him. Now, obviously, we can add on to that an air of irony here, because if they smack his belly out, he obviously dies, whereas the air suffers nothing. Now he associates the damage that's being done to the air with the damage that will be done to himself, and this is reflected in the simile describing his rifle, which is like a damaged part of himself. It is like his own smashed arm. He's numb though, and that reflects his feelings at the minute. At the moment of charging, he's not able to experience his own feelings. He needs to suppress them, and perhaps that's why he has this comic image in his head of the bullets smacking the belly out of the air, because he's trying to suppress his fear. We also have this idea of time slowing down. This is still part of the enormous sentence. And we also have the assonance with lugged and numb, a really slow sounding use of the letter U. You have to actually slow down your lips to say those words, and that obviously conveys the urgency he has in his mind compared to the slowness he feels at which he is moving. And that obviously is again reflected in the imagined damage to his body. So just as the rifle is like a smashed arm, it's completely slowing him down and making him inefficient. Okay, we've dealt with the opening and the language features, which I call soapaims, because you're probably used to that, and we started to talk about the structure with the repetition and this incredibly long first sentence slowing down time. Our next quotation comes from another stanza, so we can now start to talk about form, although remember you'll talk about form at the beginning of your essay to make sure you anchor the examiner's expectations, because form always gets you into grade 7 and above. Okay, that enormous first sentence is going to end in the middle of our quotation here with this question mark. But what we've had is a change from one stanza to another. The first stanza was 8 lines, this stanza is 7 lines, and the final stanza is 8 lines. There isn't a proper pattern here. And we've also seen how he plays with iambic rhythm and trochaic rhythm. So iambic rhythm, you remember, accents the second syllable. So he lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. That's mostly iambic. But here, bullets smacking the belly is mostly trochaic, where the first syllable is accented. And that just has the effect of disconcerting us. There isn't a natural rhythm to the poem, just as there isn't a natural rhythm to this man's run. He can't escape quickly enough. Now the second stanza is introduced at the moment when he starts to think. And what he thinks is this question that we have here. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? And this is a brilliant question. So the first way I want you to think about it is that it is a question that demands an answer. in the middle of his run. So it is as though he has stopped running and is pausing where he can be killed. However, he was running. So this questioner comes to him in a moment of stillness in his mind while his body is still furiously moving. So I think Hughes here is giving us this great moment of clarity. This is in the middle of the poem, and it's the point at which he introduces his main idea, or the soldier's main idea. The cold clockwork of the stars represents fate again, but the word cold suggests that there is an unfeeling God or an unfeeling fate at work here that does not care about the suffering of the soldiers. Begins by perhaps blaming God and fate, but then immediately moves to and the nations. So what he's saying here is that politicians and patriotism are contributing to that fate. He has been complicit in it by buying into the propaganda of politics. So he's probably joined up patriotically and now realised that that was a foolish thing to do. He's just exposing himself to death for no purpose. We get the sense that there's no purpose because in this metaphor, he is just the hand of the clock pointing that second. In other words, he's imagining that every second a new life is expunged, is killed. Every ticking second of the clock leads to another moment of slaughter and another pointless death. Another thing this metaphor does is suggests that death is unstoppable. It is a cold clockwork. It's been wound up and he can't escape the inevitable consequence. If we go a little deeper into the metaphor, the hand is obviously the hand of a clock, but also a hand pointing is an image of a physical hand pointing. And I think he deliberately picks on our collective memory of this famous recruitment poster from the First World War, the pointing hand of General Kitchener, asking young men to go to war. Now the rest of my quotations come from the final stanza, and we begin with the one that's probably most famous. So in the middle of his terror and his running at speed, he now starts to notice his surroundings. So we've just had a thought that has entered his head that's more than fear. Now he's starting to see the world in a different way. So it threw up a yellow hare that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide. Again, we've got the idea of really fast movement conveyed with these verbs, threshing, rolled, but what's being described is actually incredibly slow. It's threshing around in a circle. It's crawling, which is a very small, slow action. Rolling is much slower than running. In other words, this hare, this creature, is exposing itself to death, just like the soldier is. So one way of looking at this image is to say that the hare is a symbol for the soldier himself. The other irony, of course, is that hare in popular culture, hares are fast. That's how we use them. We would say as fast as a hare or as mad as a March hare. Those would be our two ways of thinking about hares. And Hughes is using that deliberately because it conveys the soldier's madness in war, and it also conveys the contrast between the speed at which he needs to move and the speed at which he's actually moving, still being exposed to bullets, which of course are much faster than him. That's why he appears slow. There's a lovely image here of the yellow hare like a thresher. So a thresher sorts out the wheat from the chaff when you cut down the corn. And I think here he has in mind the idea of corn being cut. This is a common image, a biblical one, that is a metaphor for life being cut down. So you'll probably remember this from All Flesh is Grass in War Photographer, which makes this an easy comparison, because I think the allusion is to the same biblical reference. We could look at the imagery of rolling and circle to suggest that war feels never-ending to the soldier in this moment. And then if we step outside this moment with Ted Hughes himself, he's writing this just after the Second War in the 1950s, and therefore asking whether war itself is a circle we can't escape. It's describing the First World War, and yet we did not escape that. It happened again in the Second World War, and presumably he is imagining a World War III coming in the future. In the 1950s we were obsessed with Russia and the nuclear threat, and many people believed a third nuclear war was inevitable. Another way of linking the hare to the soldier himself is the heat of the flame, which we had referenced before in the hot khaki, you remember. And another thing that we've got here is the double meaning of the word threw up. So here it suggests that the hare has suddenly appeared out of nowhere, but we also associate threw up with being sick, and it conveys the soldier's sickness in the moment, in his fear of war. Now we can take this whole image as a symbol of what is happening to nature. Nature has been attacked, and this hare is behaving in ways that are completely unnatural, and we've already discussed that, and it's emphasised by the different colour that the hare has become. So yellow could be used in all kinds of symbolic ways here, and you have to choose one that fits your perspective. So yellow conveys cowardice. Is the soldier feeling afraid here? But yellow also conveys happiness, which is bizarre. Is this a bizarre contrast to his fear and the hare's fear? So does he use this colour in order to point out how nature should be feeling happy and free, and yet is completely unfree? It's locked in this threshing circle and facing imminent death. Yellow is also the colour of vomit a lot of the time, and so it fits with the idea of throwing up. And also yellow hair may convey the kind of innocent angelic features of the young soldier having blonde hair. So that's alluded to through its sound. It's a homophone for being blonde, if you like. Now, if we're having only 5 quotations, we really only need one of these two. I'm going to let you decide here because I couldn't do it. Having said that, if I go back to the Fosse way, it tells me I have to write about the ending because that is where the poet delivers their final point of view. So the easiest one of these quotations to get the poet's viewpoint from is this one, so I'll deal with that one as my main ending. King, honour, human dignity, etc. dropped like luxuries. So now we have this interesting contrast in speed where all these enormous ideas like king, honour and human dignity are dropped really, really quickly, in complete contrast to the soldier who's running too slowly to escape bullets and the hare that is moving quickly but getting nowhere. So we could say that in war we're left with just our most basic natures. Everything else is stripped from us like a luxury. Now, why does he choose these things to be stripped of? Well, first he's saying that patriotism counts for nothing. Then he's suggesting that the idea of honour and going to an honourable death is a bizarre social construct and is something that does not motivate you when you're just about to be faced with bullets. The use of the word etc. also suggests that these things are actually ridiculous. They seemed important in our previous lives, that dream state that he's suddenly awoken from, but now he's got a moment of fantastic clarity that all these things we think are really important aren't. Life and living is what's important, not these artificial social constructs. Another way of looking at this triplet is to say that these are the things that justify going to war. These are the reasons that we go to war, and he's realizing that those reasons are actually ridiculous. And then we come to this ambiguous last line. I'm fascinated by this. His terror's touchy dynamite suggests that his own terror is going to explode and kill him. It might lead him to an irrational act where he perhaps charges at a machine gun. Or it might signify an internal explosion. The metaphor might mean that his mind has been dynamited and he can no longer think straight. I don't like that interpretation because it doesn't fit with this moment of clarity that he's had here, and the moment of clarity he had when he asked about the purpose of his role in the war. So for me, I focus on this word touchy. I don't see why it belongs in the poem if it's describing what's happening to him now. So all the interpretations I've offered work perfectly with his terror's dynamite. You know, we get the idea that the terror he's feeling is destructive towards him. So why touchy? Well, touchy is something that we associate with a person's feelings. So my personal interpretation here is that Ted Hughes is dealing with the feelings of the soldier after the war. So as you know, Ted Hughes's father fought in the First World War, and many readers have decided that therefore this is a recreation of an experience that his father had. Now, we don't have proof that it's his father's experience, but I like that because it gives me a way to justify why he's used the word touchy here. And this suggests that this is how his father is still incredibly sensitive to that terror years after the war has passed. Now the poem becomes not just a moment frozen in the war that he's trying to get out of, it is the reliving of that moment that he's trying to escape. So this final line invites us to imagine the soldier after the war still being the victim of his terror, and also being quite terrifying perhaps to those around him. He's still that dynamite in the image here, and therefore volatile with a temper. Or we could choose it to see as his anger at these abstract concepts that brought him to war in the first place. And so now the dynamite is his terror of the justification for war and the idea that people will continue to go to war because of these false reasons. So now we could argue that war is unnatural. It goes against the state of nature, and we can focus on that image of the yellow hare to prove it. We can also talk about the disruption of time, how speed is conveyed in the need for urgency, but contrasted with the great slowness of the sounds and rhythms of the poem. And we can talk about how nature is inverted in these quotations. So here is nature being attacked in this comic way, which acts as a complete contrast to the violence perpetrated against the men. We can talk about how his own body feels completely different, how carrying the weaponry of war acts against nature and actually seems to damage him physically. And we've got the idea of his sweat actually becoming an obstacle to him, becoming a heavy weight. So his own physical nature is acting against him because of war. And I think we can also link nature to the idea of fate. Is nature part of an unfeeling, cold God's plan, or is nature all there is, and this fate something that we have constructed for ourselves? Just like these abstract concepts which led us to war in the first place. So hopefully you've made some notes using the Fosse as your headings, and you're now ready to challenge any question in the exam using this poem. As usual, subscribe if you want more, look out for more in this series, and see you soon on my channel.